for 5 years now at Yale. It's been a wonderful force there for both substantively rich work and rigorous ideas about research design and causal inference. He's published widely on impact of oil wealth on democracy, race, class, and representation, a whole range of issues. And it's really exciting to have someone in the field and here who has a sense for big issues and at the same time has very fine-grained tools for addressing research questions. He's been here various times. His larger family is in the Bay Area, so it's sometimes possible to invite him here without high levels of coercion. So without further ado, welcome, Dan. Great to have you here.
Thank you very much, and it's nice to be here and see so many friends. Thanks for the invitation to present what is work in progress with a graduate student at Yale, Natalia Bueno, on race, class, and representation in Brazil. So this is a good moment to get feedback on this project, and there's nowhere I'd rather get it than here. So I'm glad to be able to present this project in particular. The topic is about a possible failure of descriptive representation in Brazil. And in the study of Latin American politics, there's been a lot of interest in the rise of the left over the last decade. And in some countries, interest in the rise of formerly underrepresented ethnic minorities, like in Bolivia. What I would call the puzzling whiteness of Brazilian politicians has not been subject to as much scrutiny. But the racial disconnect between the population and the political class is apparent in a number of instances. It struck me first while doing field work in Salvador, Bahia, which is a city in which the population is overwhelmingly of African descent. The city council is largely not, as I'll discuss later in the talk. And I'll be focusing on city politics a bit in this talk for various reasons, but this is a generalized phenomenon throughout Brazil at the level of federal deputies and senators and so forth. Why is the racial gap between constituents and political elites in any way puzzling? Well, one is, at a basic level, simply the strength of numbers. Brazil had a legacy of African slavery, which was much stronger than in the US, for example, so that you have large majorities that are, in principle, ethnically distinct from the political class, and you might think that democracy might lead to the election of political elites from potentially subordinate groups. Another reason why it's potentially puzzling is that electoral institutions should produce both inclusion, so there's a PR-less system, and because the PR system involves open lists, you'd think that candidate-centered campaigns might lead to the inclusion of political elites who look more like the population. And finally, there's the famous notion of racial democracy, which was associated with Gilberto Freire, the sociologist Gilberto Freire, which suggested that the fluidity of racial relations in Brazil was in stark contrast to, say, Jim Crow in the US South, the relative absence of racial prejudice and so on, supposedly in Brazil ought to lead to an electorate in which willing to elect political elites from various racial groups. So I think on its own, this question is one that intrigues me, but I think understanding the sources of the racial gap in Brazil, as in other places, can help, first of all, illuminate when racial or other potential sources of political cleavages, say social class, become politically salient, and help us understand the sources of ethnic voting in comparative perspective, which is something that I've worked on in a number of contexts. When do democratic elections translate into strong descriptive and even substantive representation is a broader way of framing what the talk is about. But I'll focus today mainly on the work in Brazil. So what I want to first do is assess behavioral explanations for the racial gap. And you may be suspicious of the racial democracy hypothesis, and my suspicion of that hypothesis in many ways motivates the behavioral work that I'll be exploring today. By behavioral, I mean work focused on individual level voting attitudes and decisions. I'm also, Natalia and I are also beginning to explore institutional and resource-based hypotheses, and I'll talk about that at the end of the talk a bit. That's more preliminary at this point. But what we're also initiating is an extent to map the extent and nature of, as well as variation in across Brazil failures of descriptive representation. When I began the project, it was based largely on an intuition from experience in Salvador, Rio, and other cities about the absence of the lack of connection between political elites and constituents, but we're trying to map that more systematically. So let me talk first about how we're starting to do that latter part. Coding race is famously complex in any setting, in Brazil especially so, because there's been a controversial debate, a vigorous debate about the extent to which categories like black and white and so forth apply in Brazil. A number of scholars have suggested that a more graded notion of race and racial identification is appropriate. Here's a simple random sample of city councilors in Salvador Bahia. There are about 43 of them. Assessing the race of any particular candidate is tricky. One way to do that is through self-identification, to interview elites. Another way to code racial identification is to ask voters in what categories they would put candidates. But obviously the issue of the type of scale to use, categorical, limited, multiple responses, is important. And also assessing the relationship between political elites and constituents depends on the constituency. So here's a sample of city councilors in Rio de Janeiro. The composition of the council might be coded as relatively white relative to Salvador, perhaps. The constituency is also, as I'll show, whiter than in Salvador. So assessing the match between constituents and elites is tricky. Our approach has been to use internet surveys in which human coders evaluate photographs of elected and non-elected candidates for various offices. So we've used images from the electoral court, which Gabe Lenz and other scholars have used in their work as well, and pictures from candidate websites, and asked coders to code those pictures. So right now we're piloting this, and what I'll present in a moment is data piloted with students at a federal university in Minas Gerais, who coded a census of councilors in Salvador and Rio, and a simple random sample of non-elected candidates in those cities. There are about 800 candidates for the city council in Salvador, and a little over 1,000 in Rio. So we took a simple random sample of those. Here we have 1 to 3 coders per candidate. We'll be rolling this out with other coders, and in particular want to probably use mechanical Turk workers around Brazil to try to get a more extensive sample of legislators, not just at city councils, but at the federal and state deputy levels as we go forward. In this case, we're randomizing candidates' photos to surveys, and also randomizing color versus black and white photographs. So the non-elected candidates only have black and white photographs. It's the little wrinkle. The electoral court publishes the photographs as black and white. We haven't found a big difference in the coding of race across the black and white and the color photographs. And then we ask coders to code the candidate's color using multiple response categories. A 0 to 1 skin tone scale from very light to very dark, and also the census categories, the IBG categories, 5-point scale that the Brazilian census uses, as well as a dichotomous variable for African descent. I think it's present some quick and dirty results on this. This is we're in the initial processes of coding, the racial gap. This pilot coding process might conceivably bias against finding a racial gap, since university students from the south, central part of the country, might be prone to coding politicians from the northeast, who would be viewed as white in that context, as non-white, and that might bias against finding a gap between political elites and constituents. Nonetheless, we find first a substantial proportion of candidates who are coded as white. That's the far left category, branco. This is the multiple response. This is the multiple response categories question, and then a number of colors, claro, moreno, claro. This more or less moves in sort of ascending direction from lightest to darkest, and then some distribution over in pardo, negro, and preto on the right-hand side, which are various terms for black. Now, to match the coding of politicians to constituencies, we need to know something about the constituencies, and to do that we have to use the census categories, which is a 5-point scale. So the census categories are branco, pardo for brown, preto for black, and amarelo for yellow, and indígena for indigenous. So we use those. In fact, it turns out that there's a pretty good match, it seems, between the extensive multi-category response questions and the 5-point scale. So here's just an example from the pictures from Salvador. The politicians who were in their color rated as branco are largely also rated by coders as branco when they're asked to use the IBG scale. Those who are coded, for example, as negro or mulatto tend to be preto. The category of pardo is more heterogeneous. So you can see that politicians who end up being coded as pardo have various kinds of skin tones, and that's an important thing to keep in mind in interpreting the results that I'll present in a moment. But using the IBG category, here's a picture of the racial distribution in Salvador. So we have the 5 census categories: white, brown, black, yellow, and indigenous. We're comparing the population proportions using the census data from 2010 to the coding of city council members. And you see about over a 20 percentage point gap between the population and the city council among whites. So substantial overrepresentation of whites and underrepresentation of browns. Interestingly, not in Salvador, an underrepresentation of people who self-identify as black, as preto. In Rio, you also see a descriptive gap. It's not as big in both percentage point and percent terms. So you see a gap of about 13 or 14 percentage points in Rio. Yeah?
Did you say that the census information about the constituencies is based on self-reported?
Yeah, so it's a census. It's a census, yeah.
It's not like they're any sort of objective.
Yeah, so that's an important distinction. So the census data is self-reported by respondents in the census, and these are codings of university coders of politicians, the city council.
Do you have analogous things for the candidates for the city council as opposed to?
Yes, we do, and I'll show that at the end of the talk. But I'll hold off on that for just now. Great. So so that's sort of the quick and dirty view of the descriptive gap in 2 cities. And as I say, we're attempting to investigate and document variation in gaps in descriptive representation on this dimension across Brazil. But what's the explanation for the racial gap? One possibility is race-based preferences, and that's the first thing that I want to investigate today. The notion that Brazil is characterized by racial democracy, as I said, might generate some suspicion. It might well be the case that in a place like Salvador, race-based preferences help explain the descriptive gap. It could be that white elites tend to hold racist preferences. It could be that in a hierarchical society with a long tradition of legacy of slavery, black or brown voters tend to even privilege white candidates, which could produce the descriptive gap in principle. So we want to try to investigate that. But the notion of racial democracy suggests that it's not race, it's class, that apparent race-based inequalities are based on class cleavages, and obviously class, income differentials, and so forth overlap with race in Brazil. So we want some way to compare as well the influence of race and class characteristics on voters' evaluations of candidates. It's difficult to infer race or class-based preferences from surveys or election returns, in part because many attributes are bundled along with race and class in actual races, and in part because elections are particularly noisy indicators of underlying preferences. So we're going to use an experiment to try to get at this first part, this first question about the behavioral preferences, about behavior and preferences. So we filmed black and white actors delivering an identical political speech. We also had versions of the experiment, conditions in which the message varied, and I'll talk about that. To emphasize the class background, we first used simply appearance, so whether the candidate was wearing a suit in giving the speech, or wearing macacão, dungarees, or a t-shirt. In another, but we also varied the message to emphasize the income and class background of the politician. Respondents were recruited, so there's a door-to-door canvass, stratified probability sample of residents in Rio and Salvador. We had an overrepresentation of Salvador, with 700 citizens, and overrepresented neighborhoods with high proportions of rich blacks and poor whites. The estimates I'll present are weighted to account for the sampling design. And we assigned subjects at random to view one of 8 versions of the speech. So 4 in which the appearance of the actor varied by race and dress, and 4 in which the candidate's message also varied to emphasize his race and class background. Manipulating race, perceptions of race in an experiment like this is difficult, and one of the issues is that potential candidates vary along lots of dimensions. So imagine presenting voters with one white candidate and one black candidate and asking them to evaluate the competence, likability of the candidate, or their intention to vote for the candidate, likely intention to vote for the candidate, while people differ in their competence and likability in ways that could confound inferences about the effect of race. Our partial solution, and this is not perfect, but we recruit many white and many black actors so as to average across, we hope, sort of race-independent fixed attributes of candidates. This is not optimal in some ways. There's a trade-off between recruiting more actors, which is going to imply in principle a better ability to identify the effect of race independent of individual characteristics that might vary across candidates, but will also decrease the precision with which we can estimate within actor experimental effects. And our only experiments are actually taking one actor and varying the dress or message of the actor. And so we want to be able to also pin down those kinds of within actor experimental effects. So we opted for an intermediate approach, which is 6 white and 6 black actors recruited from each city. We hope that having some variation across actors diminishes the influence of, say, race-independent characteristics that influence vote intention, but that nonetheless still allow us to estimate within actor experimental effects given our sample size. So that's stimulating perceptions of race. Class, as with race, as I said, the first strategy is appearance-based. So we're dressing candidates in suits or in more working-class clothing. We also varied the stated message. Rich candidate said, in Salvador, I'm a lawyer, I've been a professor in a private middle school, I graduated from the Federal University, I've worked with NGOs to improve the quality of life in our neighborhoods and the quality of schools. Poor candidate said, I've been a working person all of my life. I grew up in the popular neighborhoods of Salvador and completed my education here. I've worked as a taxi driver and a mechanic. Later, I was a political organizer and leader in the Mechanics Union. I know the struggles that ordinary people face in their daily lives because I'm part and parcel of the people, povão. So the messages, in some sense, weren't optimal. There are other aspects of the messages that differ. That's not optimal because we're combining lots of features that might influence people's perceptions. But our goal here is simply to try to stimulate perceptions of class and compare that to the effect of perceptions of race. And so we want to use just simply the variation in appearance. And then we'll also evaluate whether the message added much to the variation induced by appearance. And as we'll see, actually, the appearance did seem to do most of the work in this experiment. Okay, so before presenting the results, a few things about whether we stimulated perceptions of race. subjects, about 75% of the subjects perceived the candidate's race as intended. That is, if they were exposed to a politician that we had coded, a candidate that we coded as black, they said the politician was preto. If exposed to a politician we perceived to be white, they perceived the politician as branco. But still, there was some slippage. About 25% said the candidate was brown rather than black or white. That was twice as likely for subjects assigned to white candidates. So there's some disconnect between our perception of the candidates that we hired for the experiment and what respondents perceived, but not huge. Interestingly, we found little evidence that perceived social class whitens candidates, which is something that various scholars have suggested, in particular about Brazil. Among subjects exposed to black candidates, 73% said the candidate was black when he wore a suit, and 75% said so when he didn't wear a suit. The difference isn't significant, and this is true also with the manipulation of the message. So even when the message manipulates background, it doesn't shape and didn't shape in this experiment perceptions of the race of the candidate, which we thought was interesting. For class, wearing a suit, just wearing a suit moved perceptions of class 0.5 points higher on a 5-point income scale. So we said that using the IBG's categories from E to A, which income group would you assign? Do you think this politician belongs to? And the ones who wore a suit were assigned to a category 0.5 points higher than those who didn't. The message only shifted, message plus suit shifted perceptions by 0.6. So the message didn't add much to the perception that the candidate was from a higher income group. So here I'm going to pool across the suit and suit plus message conditions. We get pretty similar results with both. Black politicians are on average rated 0.3 points lower on the income scale. So just being black does influence perceptions of class, but wearing a suit moves perceptions by about the same amount for both black and white politicians. So in sum, we think we were able to manipulate perceptions of income background and race of the politicians pretty successfully. Okay, the next thing for presenting the design and the results is to categorize subject race. Survey respondents classified using the IBG categories. We asked them for open-ended responses, and we asked them to use the IBG categories. They tended to be quite consistent across the two, actually, just as in the coding I presented for politicians, more heterogeneity for the Paldu category, the brown category. So I'm going to conduct the analysis with black subjects, meaning anyone who identified as either black or brown using the IBG categories, and also present results separately for respondents who said they were black, so excluding those who said they were Paldu. And our sampling design for respondents excluded Amarelu and Indígena, which are the other two IBG categories. They're a extremely low frequency group in Rio and Salvador, and so we excluded them by design. And then we use the census categories to code the class or the income group of the respondents as well. So the AB we're going to put in a rich group, and CDE we'll put in a poor group for purposes of comparing the class, coding the class relationship between respondents and politicians. So one way to think about the design is that black and white subjects, where black can mean either black and brown or just black, were assigned at random to the 4 treatment conditions depicted in the table. Subject and politician have the same race and different race, or subject and politician have the same class and different class. And those are the numbers in the experiment. Paldu is brown, yeah. So, so without the browns, our N goes down to 831. Including the browns, we have a subject pool of 1,200 respondents. So here's the first table of main results on the experiment. We can read the results two ways, comparing the rows or comparing the columns. Comparing the rows gives the effect of race, candidate race, on evaluations of the candidates. Comparing the columns gives the effect of class. And what we see is across the rows, little difference. Nothing that is significant at standard levels, and indeed pooling across class conditions, we'd see point estimates that are almost the same for the two rows. So we see almost no difference in average evaluations of the black of the same race and different race candidates. Looking at the effect of class, we seem to see something in the first row. So there's some borderline significant difference between evaluations of politicians from the same class and politicians from a different class, but only within the same racial group. The second row, we don't see a significant difference between the two columns. One interpretation of this is that there's some unanticipated effect of class that depends on racial homogeneity. That would be an interpretation. Another interpretation is that something unusual happened. This isn't a big point for this talk because I'm mainly going to focus on the effects of race, but I think my money would be on something unusual happening. It seems weird that you would have, for example, almost identical, statistically indistinguishable evaluations of politicians who are from the same race and class, that's the top left cell, and politicians who are from a different race and a different class, that's the bottom right cell, but then somehow politicians would pay a penalty when they're from a different class and from the same race. So it seems odd. I think we need some further replication and probing of that result. But the main result is we don't see a big difference here by race. If we look at white respondents and black respondents separately, we also see quite similar findings. Again, some apparent effect of class when we look at the same race group in the top row, but comparing the top row to the bottom row, we see little effect of race, and indeed some effect for white respondents that seems to go in the other direction when subjects and politicians are from a different class. So there also we don't see strong effects of race on candidate evaluations. This is another way to look at the results, now stratifying not by white and black, but by rich and poor respondents, as in the AB category and the CDE category. And we see some class effects for poor respondents. Again, that's primarily in the same racial group, but not big effects for not big apparent effects for race. We looked separately at results in the cities of Rio and Salvador and didn't see big differences. We did see a stronger class effect, especially in that first row in Rio, than in Salvador. But we didn't see any difference in the race effects. So the effect of candidate race, or the sameness of the race of the candidate and the respondent on evaluations of the candidate, is statistically indistinguishable from zero across these different strata as well, and for various subgroups. Finally, I just mentioned about the experiment. The subjects were also asked about the politician's likability, trustworthiness, intelligence, competence, impressiveness, motives in seeking office, capacity to confront challenges, capacity to do a good job in office, and the quality of his ideas. Whether the politician would preoccupy himself with people like the subject and with concerns of people like the subject, whether the politician would keep his promises, and if not, whether people like the subject and hold him accountable, whether people like the subject would receive more benefits or jobs from the government if the candidate were elected. So along with vote intention, we're trying to tap whether candidate race and class affected voter evaluations of these attributes to candidates. And we don't, again, find effects of race and class. There are a couple of starred differences of means in various tables, none that survive standard adjustments for multiple statistical comparisons. So we don't see effects, basically, of race and class. So does this mean there's a lack of race and maybe a lack of class effects? Well, several possible concerns you might raise about the experiment. The stimulus seems somewhat artificial. It's a DVD player with a candidate giving a political speech. We designed the intervention to be like the free television hours that, on which every candidate for city council was granted space by the Brazilian Electoral Commission. So these are free electoral hours in which candidates appear and present small speeches, very much like the ones that we showed on the DVD players to candidates. So, we think there's some case for the stimulus being a little artificial in a door-to-door canvass, but it's quite similar to stimuli about candidates that voters would actually be exposed to in a real election. There are nuances of racial self-classification. Maybe there's some measurement error, quote unquote, in the racial classification of politicians. We do find similar null effects even if we look at other measures of racial self-classification. So we asked respondents to identify as an Afro-Brazilian. We asked them to respond to multiple color categories. We didn't find big differences there. So something else I'd mention, I've done quite similar experiments in other contexts, in Mali and India and some other settings, and have detected pretty big co-ethnicity effects using a very similar experimental design with videotaped speeches. So there may be ways in which measurement error or artificiality of a stimulus depresses estimates of causal effects relative to true causal effects, but or attenuates them towards zero. But these kinds of designs have detected the causal effects of candidate race or of the co-ethnic relationship between respondents and candidates in other settings. So what I'd say, I think that if there were large race effects in the electorate, the exposure to a candidate of a different race shaped evaluations strongly, that it seems plausible they'd be detected here. And I think we should replicate this, and I'd like to explore some lower cost ways of doing this. I think doing the DVD, showing the DVD players has the advantage of kind of aping the free electoral hour in maybe a convincing way, but there might be ways to use photographs and so on with even online, using even internet surveys to try to replicate these results in other populations and see if they hold up. But for the moment, it seems that there's not strong evidence of race and class effects. And so, of course, this leaves us with the puzzle that we began with, what explains failures of descriptive representation in places like Salvador. And I'm going to present some initial evidence to explore some hypotheses. Maybe it's about candidate entry. Maybe there's some barriers to entry. These are open list PR systems where there are a lot of candidates, but maybe it's easier for candidates of particular racial backgrounds to get into the candidate pool. Maybe there are systematic differences in candidate resources that affect the extent to which candidates are elected, electability, and maybe there is some party influence, and that's something we've just been playing with a little bit recently. So what I want to do to finish the talk is just to present some kind of initial descriptive statistics on these hypotheses, and hopefully generate some discussion about how to probe them further. So first, looking at candidate entry. So this is the question Jason asked. This presents the coding of the non-elected candidates along with elected candidates and the population distribution of the using the IBT categories. So we want to compare the yellow to the white, the non-elected to the population, and what we see is that they're quite similar. In particular, we don't have the big overrepresentation of white candidates in the candidate pool relative to the population that we have for the elected candidates. So the red bar is a whole lot bigger for the white group than the yellow bar. We see some underrepresentation of the brown group. It's less pronounced relative to winning candidates. And we see a population distribution of black citizens that about matches the pool both of unelected candidates and successful candidates. We see some more yellow and indigenous entrants. So that's Salvador. We see something similar in Rio. There's a little actually underrepresentation of white candidates relative to relative to the population. So overrepresentation of winners and underrepresentation of losers for the white group. Pretty similar match for the brown group between the non-elected and the population, and even an overrepresentation of candidates, slight overrepresentation of candidates among the black group. So yellow is bigger than white for the black group, but again, in Rio we have a massive underrepresentation of the black group among the winners. So these are important comparisons. It's just an initial comparison, but it doesn't seem like candidate entry is going to be doing the major part of the work. We do find huge differences in candidate resources descriptively across winners and losers. So candidates have to declare their assets. And here we're showing the mean assets of those who are elected in 2008 against those who are not elected in the first row, and also everybody who's in office now against those who are not in office. These groups differ a little bit because some candidates who were elected after 2008 leave office. They go on to become state or federal deputies, for example, and they're replaced by supplencies or alternates. And we see huge differences. So a difference in the asset value between successful and unsuccessful candidates in 2008 of 324,000 reais, which is about 160,000 US dollars. So big differences in asset values across candidates. And we also see a difference between white and non-white candidates in resources. So white candidates, both elected and non-elected, are substantially wealthier than non-white candidates. This isn't obviously presented to suggest a causal interpretation, but it does suggest that there's systematic differences between both the winners and the losers, and white candidates and non-white candidates in terms of the assets that they own. The final hypothesis that we've been playing with has to do with party influence. So Brazil's open list PR system is said to weaken party control over nominees. So candidates choose from party lists, but within party lists, they have it's a single non-transferable vote. They select a particular candidate from the list. And so that generates, according to, say, Carey and Shugart and a lot of literature, incentives to cultivate the personal vote, and strengthens or heightens intra-party competition and weakens party control over nominees. So one of the things, that's the story about Brazilian elections that's most prominent. We noted some striking differences in the 5-digit codes that are assigned to candidates. So these are the codes that you have to use to select candidates when you go to the voting booth. And now, thanks to Danny Hidalgo's work, we know about the effect of electronic voting machines in Brazil. Now it's all electronic across the whole country. And so when voters go into the voting booth, they have to remember the 5-digit code of the candidate they want to vote for. And now they see the picture of the candidate come up, and they can verify that they've selected the correct candidate. But we saw some really interesting things just sort of looking over the data. So prominent people in our data set, like Leonel Brizola Neto is the grandson of Brizola, who's the former governor of Rio de Janeiro, has the code 12345. Clarissa Garotinho, who's the daughter of 2 former governors of Rio de Janeiro, has the code 15123. Now the first 2 numbers refer to the party. So 12 and 15 refer, so 15 is Garotinho's party, but the other 3 numbers are not party specific. Now, we also noted cases like Vera Lins, who has the code 11111. She's the wife of a prominent deputy in Brazil. Now, we're investigating more. We're going to do some more work trying to investigate how codes are assigned. There's some electoral law suggesting that they're assigned by lottery. Which isn't crazy. I mean, it could be that the electoral authorities are selecting easy-to-remember numbers, and then candidates are being granted numbers, in which case we're looking at the causal effect of numbers, maybe. But I don't think that's actually the case. I think that there's maybe some lottery, but there's also some holdover of numbers from previous elections, and there seems to be maybe some party influence over the numbers. So we want to investigate that. But this looks suspiciously more akin to party tickets or rankings on closed lists than it does to open list PR. So we're kind of interested by that. We did a quick and dirty thing. We need to improve this, but we just wanted to look at whether having repeated digits, the number of repeated digits, made a difference, or having digits in sequence. So if you're for example, you have 1, 2, 3, 7, 7. So 5 numbers 5 numbers with a sequence, adjacent sequence. Say like 1, 2, 3. We code that as 3 numbers, 3 digits that are adjacent. Obviously, we need to improve that because we're not taking into account here the fact that the first 2 digits are party linked. But we just wanted to look at whether there's any relationship, and then we created a dichotomous indicator, a good number, if either the number of repeated digits was at least equal to 3, or the digits in the sequence was at least equal to 3, and just kind of probe that. We do see some differences, particularly between those in office and those not in office, on the digits in sequence. So we looked at both elected in 2008 and in office versus not in office. And I think this comparison is good because the supplentios, the alternates who come to office, are the ones who got the most votes in the elections, but we see something similar if we look at elected in 2008 as well. So here we have a difference, 0.27, p-value of 0.01. Maybe there's something going on in the second row. We didn't see, though, differences in race. So we don't see here significant differences comparing white candidates to not white candidates in terms of the quality of their numbers. And indeed, the final row goes in the opposite direction of the hypothesis that whites are getting better numbers. So that's an interesting observation about Brazilian elections that we'd like to probe more. It may not be part of the explanation for why we have the gap the racial gap in Brazil, but it certainly merits further investigation. So in sum, I think what we have at this point is little evidence for strong race-based preferences in the electorate, little evidence that candidate entry explains the failures of descriptive representation, at least at the local level. In Rio and Salvador, it does seem that maybe hypotheses about candidate resources are the most promising. Of course, here causal inferences may ultimately be tentative. It's hard to pin down what the causal influence of race is. Candidates differ in lots of ways that may have nothing to do with race, even if causally, even if correlated with race. And so thinking about it, the causal interpretation of candidate race in light of the evidence about candidate resources is challenging. But what we want to do next is first we want to expand the descriptive part of the project where we map variation in descriptive representation more exhaustively across states and local offices, because we found that there's a big difference, say, between Rio and Salvador in terms of the extent of failures of descriptive representation, which we found interesting, and we'd like to document that more systematically. And then planning to do more work this summer on the allocation of campaign resources, and particularly how the process of assigning candidate codes works. I'm sorry to raise a puzzle that I hope some of you found interesting and not offer you the ultimate explanation for it, but that's work in progress, and that's why they call it research. Sometimes you get null results, and I think null results are important and underreported, certainly, in our discipline, so I'm here to present null results, and perhaps I'll publish them someday in the Journal of Null Results if somebody would like to found such a journal. So that's all I have for the formal part of the presentation. Okay, sure.
So I have a question and a comment on a totally different topic. So the question is, you assume you put actor fixed effects in your estimation, and are they big? Do you get big variation in the dependent variables depending on which particular person you put in there?
Yeah, so we've tried that, and should I answer?
That's the question.
We've tried that, yeah, and we do get some differences. And so if you run a regression and the F statistic comparing the unrestricted regression to the restricted regression is significant. So there are some candidate fixed effects.
And you actually had one candidate. I haven't decided this is an issue, but you obviously had a candidate play of a given race, play it being rich or poor, but you couldn't have a certain candidate play it being white or black.
Exactly.
So you're going to have, when you put the fixed effects in, you're going to have a different degree of correlation with the race analysis, and it's going to really limit your power on the race relative to class. So I thought it was kind of interesting that you got some more class effects and not race effects. But anyway, we can think about that. That's a weird design feature that has some statistical implications. But so that was the question, and maybe there's more to say there. But the comment has to do with party influence.
Can I say something about that really quickly before we go? Because I think, just because I think it's a super interesting question. I mean, this is a problem about detecting effects of race. I mean, this is the Paul Holland critique, like, is race really manipulable? We're manipulating characteristics of candidates at only within all of those fixed attributes, like dress and message and so on. And I think
the fixed effects picks that up to some extent, but you don't know if you've got. I mean, with the within race, the within class comparison is totally within candidates. So that picks it all up. The fixed effects picks up all the possible extraneous variation in terms of low versus high class, because you have the same person.
Yeah.
But you've got between individual analysis in race. And so
no, that's true.
It's a very different design, really, for the class versus the race. Comparing rows is very different from comparing columns in terms of what is actually controlled.
I agree with you. I agree with you completely.
But anyway, on the party control, in the UK, I don't understand the party system well enough in Brazil, but in the UK, what happens to minority candidates? There's huge descriptive representation problem, and it's almost all operating at the electorate stage, so it's all about candidate entry and party control. And it's basically the story, to oversimplify, is the parties put minority candidates in the districts where they're not going to win. Therefore, they show that they've got the right kind of balance of candidates, but they never win. So I don't know if that's something that's plausible in your story.
I think it could be. I mean, we thought when we found this thing about the party codes, we thought, aha, you know, maybe it's the case that parties are prioritizing white candidates. And I think that could well be plausible. They may, just at first blush, it doesn't seem like they're doing it through the codes, but they can do it through...
Whether they're being, the distribution of minorities in the, if they are part of a party that always runs poorly in this particular locale versus always runs poorly.
So these are
needs electoral history in your analysis.
Yeah, exactly. So these are constituency-wide elections. So in a city council race, it's citywide. In a state election, it's statewide.
But there aren't constituency variations?
No, it's all one big. So like the state of Sao Paulo in the federal Congress elects 70 deputies, and there are thousands of candidates. Well, no, I don't think, but it's not geographic, but I think it's correct in that I think there are mechanisms through which parties are privileging, say, strong candidates, and they might think strong candidates are white candidates, and I think you're right that it seems to me that looking at mechanisms of party control is important, and you know, the received wisdom about Brazil is that there's not that kind of party control because of the electoral system, and we're starting to suspect that's wrong. So I think you're right. It's just I don't think it's geographic. Gabe.
It's a little controversial, but most researchers think that race matters a lot in U.S. voting. But if you were to run your experiment in the U.S., you'd probably find no effects of voting on race because everyone, there's a strong norm of equality, and they know they're being studied, and they know they don't want to look racist. And so I just wondered, I have no idea for Brazil if there's a norm like that there.
So that's a good point. I mean, the first thing I would say is we should do that experiment because it'd be interesting to know. The second thing I would say is you're going door to door with respondents and you're asking them to take a look at a candidate and rate the candidate on a scale from 1 to 7. Obviously, people are carrying around different scales in their head, like in any survey. But you know, they may know that they're being studied, and they may know they see a black candidate, but they don't have any idea how other respondents have rated candidates along the scale, and there's no. I don't think social desirability bias would suggest that, you know, a dip from 4.5 to 3.5 is going to be perceived by the respondent as tipping off the interviewer that they're racist. So, you know, I think, and again, this kind of design has picked up race effects, co-ethnicity effects in a lot of settings. So, you know, obviously something we're worried about a lot.
If you were to ask people, what would they say? Would they say it's okay to only vote for white candidates, or would they?
No, I think there's a social desirability bias. If I were to guess, it's stronger even in Brazil than it might be in some places in the U.S. because of the myth of the notion of racial democracy. Eric.
Yeah, I just think about the interpretation of the experimental finding. Like the way you're talking about it is that the null finding makes us wonder more about why there's a failure of descriptive representation. But another interpretation is that the null finding in some sense allows for a failure of descriptive representation. Right? If everybody's voting based on race and it's a proportional system, then you'll get a descriptively representative outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's almost like the reverse. So the fact that people, I mean, if you take the experimental results to the limit, the fact that people aren't responding to that cue is what allows for these other mechanisms to get you a bias, right? I mean, you can imagine with a different electoral system, you could also imagine, if only the whites were voting based on race and the other people aren't, that could also lead to it. But it just seems like that. So I'm just wondering how you think about that.
Your article would be rejected by the Journal of Non-Findings.
It might be rejected by the Journal of Non-Findings, so perhaps I want it published in the Journal of Findings. I take your suggestion. I mean, what would theorists of descriptive representation do with your question? I think there are also kind of normative implications if you're right. Because this is a tangent, but the motivation for the paper is that there's a failure of descriptive representation. If there aren't race-based preferences, maybe that apparent failure or disconnect between the attributes of the electorate and political elites is sort of less important to worry about. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the proportional system is just what makes it like in the U.S., you can have a group that's 20% of the electorate, and if everybody's voting based on race, then based on how the districts are aligned, you could have 100% white, and the 20% that, say, African American, don't get represented at all.
Mm-hmm.
But in a proportional system, it just seems like by definition, the dynamic's different, and so it just seems like the normative questions are different, it just plays out very differently. So
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, I'm puzzling through how to think about that.
Yeah, so just related to that, so I don't know anything about Brazil, but the background is that people think of descriptive representation in racial terms. So you're assuming that's kind of your baseline assumption, right? Because the null finding is with respect to some theoretical expectation that it is going to be about race. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that does the survey part tell you anything about the meaning of race, or in other words, the salience of race? Is there anything to be said about the salience of race in Brazilian society, the fact that you're getting the null finding? Or is it something specific? So for example, endogamy versus, would you find a similar lack of salience on, racial intermarriage and some other things? I know you've done work in India, and so, these questions are studied in India, or is this a voting thing as opposed to some broader statement on what race means?
Yeah. I can draw more from the kind of the secondary literature on race in answering those questions than I can in some ways from the survey, because I think asking people, to self-identify in various ways doesn't pick up salience particularly well. Although I will say we asked people, one parenthesis to that is that we asked people if they identified as Afro-Brazilian, and that's a term that's taken on kind of a political salience because it's been part of the mobilization of race as a politically salient characteristic. So there are even candidates who are elected, a few of them, as Afro-Brazilians who run Afro-Brazilian campaigns, and there's been a little bit of work on that. I mean, as another parenthesis, the degree of representation is still really low. So one study by someone named Gladys Mitchell found that there are only 11 deputies who self-identified as Afro-Brazilian out of over 500, and one senator. So you get 2% representation, if that, of candidates who self-identify as Afro-Brazilian. Nonetheless, that term is salient, and it's linked to mobilization along racial lines. So we were interested to find that we found some subjects respondents who identified as Afro-Brazilian. When we code the degree of match between citizens and elites using that classification, though, we still find no results, interestingly. So. But in terms of the broader salience of race, I think that's increased in Brazil would be my impression, my casual impression. So there's been there's been affirmative action in various cities and in federal hiring as well. But educational quotas at the municipal level have been an important thing in Brazil in the last decade, and there have been Afro-Brazilian movements that have gained political salience, and so. I think maybe the notion or myth of racial democracy is right in that there was not Jim Crow, and there's exogamy. I mean, I didn't even know that exogamy makes sense in the Brazilian context, because there is this idea of a racial continuum in some ways. I don't recall, this is a little while ago, and I have to go back and look. I think we missed the intermarriage question, which I have asked in work in India, which, by the way, unsurprisingly suggests that people are not very keen on exogamy in India. Yeah.
I just think on the same lines, that you need some information in here to corroborate how important this dimension of descriptive representation is, because you can only achieve, with a limited candidate pool, descriptive representation on so many dimensions at once. And so, without knowing anything about the social context, one possible interpretation is that they have indeed achieved perfect descriptive representation on dimensions they care about, and this happens not to be one of them. I mean, maybe they have descriptive representation on, cat lovers versus dog lovers or something like that. And it's just, there are just other dimensions that matter to them, and this one doesn't. I mean, it seems so important that how can that possibly be true? But
yeah.
Without that piece here, I don't know what's really missing here about what are they losing out on in terms of representation.
Yeah, no, I think that's an important question, and obviously we're not studying the link to substantive representation either here. I mean, this is a society that had, in which there was slavery until 1888. There's a long legacy of race-based prejudice, even if notwithstanding the hypothesis of racial democracy. So I do think race is salient in that way. But yeah, you're absolutely right. We don't know how salient race is or how it maps onto other dimensions. And I think, let's see, if you take a look at this picture, I mean. What's the salient failure of descriptive representation? Gender, I would think. Yeah, it's the first thing that would leap out at me, but but maybe race too. So I mean, there are a lot of, your point is there are a lot of dimensions on which there might be failures of descriptive representation, and I agree. Jess. Oh, I'm sorry, Miguel had his hand up, and then Jess.
Okay.
I
had two questions. One, the first question is, there's, because of the electoral system, tons of city councilmen are in these elections, and I think Scott Esposito's done some work where he finds that there's one or two candidates that are, he surveyed for race effects, and one or two candidates where he manipulates their race. You don't get an effect, but what happens is when you expand the number of choices, people start taking these cognitive shortcuts, and the race effects are huge. And so I'm just wondering to what extent this could be about number, being overwhelmed by choice. And that sort of would speak to, what is the external validity of this. And then secondly, sort of as an extension of Gabe's question, I'm curious, at least in the sort of experimental work I've done in Brazil, there's also special desirability from the interviewer. And I wanted to know, kind of if you tested, race of the interviewer and kind of interviewer effects, because you're not really masking, what's being asked. In addition, there is, especially in sort of lower class communities, you can imagine there's a social desirability that might, affect the results.
Yeah, those are good questions. I don't know what would happen if we exposed respondents to a swath of candidates and asked them to pick. I don't know Scott's work on this. I do know some of the work that a sociologist, for example, called Almeida, that I picked on a little bit in the talk in the citation, has some work that exposes people to a range of pictures about candidates. And I think it's unsatisfactory for exactly the reason that even in pictures there are probably fixed effects, that some people just look friendly and you'd like to vote for them, and it's race independent, and so it's difficult to separate those features of candidates from. So you need a more complicated design, possibly, where you have lots of candidates assigned together to independent lists and shown to voters, and you can pool across various randomizations. That's a lot of randomization. So I haven't seen that kind of design. So I think that would be interesting to know, but don't have a strong sense of that. Jess, what was your second question?
It was about the interviewer.
Oh yes, no, they're very homogeneous. Sorry, we had a 40 to 50-year-old, a group of 40 to 50-year-old women interviewers of about the same skin tone. It worked out that way. We see no candidate effects. There's very little heterogeneity across the interviewers, and that probably explains it. Yeah.
Well, in Brazil, you just showed a picture of someone of a given race. You asked the interviewer what party, they asked the respondent what party they're a member of, or what their ideology is. Did they take any information from that?
That is a great question, and we didn't ask. I don't think so, because parties aren't strongly linked to racial groups. If they thought that race and class were strongly linked, they might identify, I'm guessing, this is something we should test, but I'm guessing they might identify the Workers' Party, the PT, maybe as having more black candidates. On the other hand, the president of the PT is a white man, although some work has suggested that a lot of voters code Lula as black, actually. But he's from... So take that take that with a grain of salt, but there it is. And so but I think there isn't. Basically, the short answer is I don't think there's strong linkage of racial groups to parties in Brazil, and we also found not huge effects of race on perceived class. So on our 5-point scale, the black candidates were on average rated 0.3 points lower. But that suggests that even if there's a party that's a class-based party like the Workers' Party, it's not necessarily going to generate a strong association between that and the race of candidates. Again, making some inferential leaps, but it should be tested.
The thing in the U.S. is that, it's controversial how many race effects define experiments here. But you find large effects when it's actually queuing off ideology and race. Right? If I show you, if I show you I'm going to cut government spending, and I'll tell you how, but I stick in a black hand versus a white hand, that has a very large effect. And then, because everyone thinks, oh, if I stick in the black hand, I tell the same as social welfare expenditures. You see what I'm saying? So if it's not linked that way, that's information in and of itself about the part. Now, whether that's good or bad information is complicated, right? Because in the data, the income distribution, it does correlate with race. So the mind of voters is not correlated, and it's not correlated with parties, it could be a failure. That might not be a good thing, it could be a failure of that position being represented, right?
Yeah.
Or it could be, height. So that's
yeah.
a question. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think those are good questions. Great questions. We asked, do you think your chances of getting a job or of people like you getting a job would go up if this candidate were elected? Things that aren't tied, it's not like asking about welfare in the U.S., but that are tied to distributive expectations and didn't find effects. I mean, I thought we probably would. Now, that could be a nature of the office, and we did this with city council people. It's not the most powerful office in the world. Maybe we should do it with state legislators or even with a governor. It's that kind of design, as a matter of the experimental design, raises some issues because people know who the gubernatorial candidates are. And we thought because the electoral system is very similar for city council members as it is for state and federal deputies, and because those people are closest to voters in many ways, that it might be the best place to test ideas about race-based preferences. But I was surprised we didn't find more distributive effects, so we should probe it further. Yes?
I mean, affirmative action now it's a big thing, but you don't see like politicians actually trying to gain votes with that. You see like judicial, the Supreme Court or professors in universities, but you don't see actually politicians championing it. So it's really hard, and I don't know how things are in Salvador, but it's in Sao Paulo. I've seen one federal deputy actually saying, oh, I'm going to represent the black people in Congress. You don't see that actually happening a lot. And I would imagine that city councilmen would actually try to gain votes with racial or descriptive representation. But my question is, in the speeches, they all seem left-wing. And my impression is that most candidates that are black or that are supposed to represent the black population are from the Workers' Party or other left-wing parties. So it seems that people, when they're seeing the candidates, they are seeing actually left-wing politicians.
Yeah, maybe.
And the other thing about class, one thing that if you're going to do that is to randomize grammar mistakes, because you see a lot of lower class politicians that I think they actually make mistakes on purpose to identify more population. And you see Lula doing that all the time. So maybe one.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, I mean, I take your point that there isn't a lot of campaigning on, say, by Afro-Brazilians on racial grounds. On the other hand, I'm not sure I would contest a little bit the idea that there's no, and you or others may know a lot more about this than I do, but I would contest the idea that there's not campaigning on affirmative action. I mean, I think Benedita da Silva in Rio took a lot of, some political credit for the rolling out of affirmative action in Rio, and I also think that the idea that affirmative action or race in general would be linked to the PT, this gets back to Jazz's question, is a little contestable. I mean, affirmative action began in Brazil under Cardoso, and the ideas started to be developed, and he's not from the Workers' Party. So, again, I don't have a lot of good evidence about that point, but I think it's something to probe further. Yeah, we're really worried about this accent issue or grammar mistakes issue in terms of whether you can manipulate class. So we had the same actors put on a suit and wear dungarees or T-shirts, number one, and then manipulated the message. But, is a relatively uneducated candidate from Salvador able to credibly say, I'm a lawyer educated from the Federal University of Bahia. We didn't know. And it did turn out that most of the action in our data came from the dress, not from the message. So maybe one explanation for that is we couldn't effectively stimulate people's perceptions of class or income background because people differ, and they develop attributes that are associated with education as they go. So, I mean, I think this gets back to the point about the manipulability of race relative to class. It might be that class background is also difficult to manipulate for the same reasons. These are fixed attributes of people. We're not intervening to manipulate the class or race background of the candidate.
Yeah, kind of on that point, perhaps indirectly. I mean, you know, when we think about campaigns in the U.S. and they occur over time, not just, you know, one look at a picture or something like that. But, you know, we know that candidates at times will try and, you know, play up or play down their class background. You know, Romney wearing jeans all the time. I haven't heard the word dungarees in a long time, by the way. So it was interesting. But,
some translation for mucka, kind of like
dungarees. No,
I also quite like sport, by the way.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know, it was Romney's statement.
Okay.
Romney likes sport. Really a man of the people. Knows NASCAR owners and likes sport. So
but in any case, you know, so is it seen that way that if somebody is dressed a particular way, that is seen as something like relatively, you know, fixed or whatever that is? How is class thought about, like, with regards to those kinds of things? That is, you know, people might present themselves in different ways to different audiences around different issues and the like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is quite the spirit of your question, but informality is a big thing in Brazil, and people are informal, even elites. But on the other hand, political elites and business elites will often appear in, you know, suits, and that's very uncharacteristic of people who aren't business or political elites. And so the wearing of a suit and tie should shift expectations about the kind of person that a voter is encountering. There might be occasions on which, you know, a candidate wants to go out and be a person of the people and dress down. But nonetheless, the capacity to manipulate expectations about class through dress seemed certainly high.
So I have two small questions. One was whether this doesn't get around the problems that Jazz raised, but maybe a little bit in terms of Laura did. I think that there, with photographs anyway, perhaps even with videotapes, there are ways to manipulate the lightness or darkness of the images, especially when you have such a gradation like this. You know? And there are some experiments that try to do this. And so I just wondered if you consider the feasibility of doing that. Because then you could have the same actor and then manipulate their race in the same way you manipulate their class, and so you get around some of those fixed effects.
Yeah, I mean, we thought about photoshopping, and I've thought about more since. There are so many aspects of appearance that go into forming an impression about racial heritage that sort of manipulating the skin tone seems somehow beside the point. I mean, even in this, and we found this more in other sets of pictures, but even here you have a lot of variation in terms of how, you know, how people are classified, even with similar skin tones. And this could be, you know, different coders assigning different, we need to do this with more coders and so on, but this guy here is the modal coding of him is pardo, you know, and the modal coding of these two are preto. Pretty similar, maybe pretty similar skin tones. This guy is also coded as pardo, even though his core is claro, and that's why, I mean, pardo is a more heterogeneous category.
Right. But you could move people on the margin. I mean,
yeah.
You know. So that's just a possibility. And I also was having, secondarily, I had a similar thought to Eric about this, how the descriptive representation might suffer because of the equality norm, or the ideology of racial democracy that dominates in Brazil. And it's widely seen as illegitimate to vote on the basis of racial identification. And that might lead to much less descriptive representation, especially in a proportional system. But I was curious, since you found such strong effects in other contexts, India, Mali, whether in those kinds of contexts you do have better descriptive representation, or at least with regard to the things that people are saying that they care about.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, but the normative implications of that are complicated, but I was
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I don't know the comparability, but as a point of interest, I'm interested in that question, and you know, I think it's quite complicated. In Mali, for example, you have a setting in which ethnicity is not said to be salient, but we found co-ethnic preferences, and there's a legislature that looks a lot like, and there's PR, region-wide PR in the assembly, but the assembly looks more like the population in that regard. So ethnicity not salient politically, or parties aren't linked to ethnic groups, and yet some evidence of co-ethnic voting, co-ethnic preferences, and better, in that sense, descriptive representation.
I mean, in one sense,
India,
it's not surprising that you should have congruence, greater congruence on dimensions that people care about and vote on. You know, so maybe that's
yeah. So, I mean, I think I found our experimental results persuasive. They went against my priors. I think we should replicate this, and others should as well. Because, you know, to say there's an absence of race-based preferences, I mean, that's a little stronger than I'd want to be at this point. It's what our evidence suggests. I think, you know, we looked at white and black actors. There are various things you could imagine. Maybe it's something more about graded skin tones. Maybe it's the Pardue category where you really get the action. So we can't deny that, and I don't want to suggest that I think the evidence proves an absence of race-based preferences. But nonetheless, I think it makes I mean, I have to think a bit more about whether it makes the puzzle of lack of descriptive representation on this dimension more or less puzzling. I think you can make the argument both ways. So Jason and then Ben.
Yeah, just a quick thing. So in India, you can code on name. So does that work? Are there any other things that you can use any of that stuff?
Unless his name is Negão or something, which means big black, which actually was part of our speech, our message for the poor black condition was, I'm José Paulo de Oliveiras, and other people know me as Negão. So there is a way to, I mean, a lot of nicknames. What I'm saying is popular nicknames have a racial. And if you've ever hung out with capoeiristas, they all have race-based nicknames, which would make Americans with, you know, our political correctness around issues of race blush. So, you know, people are named things like Little Black Bean, Feijão, or Preto, or Pretão, or something. So those are, it's the way in which people see race and race terms very different. You know, did that answer? Ben?
I'm thinking about rhetoric that I've heard in Brazil about people who are critical of sort of the Black Power movement that's been tried to be imported into Brazil and hasn't gotten a lot of traction, or people who sort of defend the racial democracy hypothesis or notion. And they would sort of look at this and say, well, see, there you go. You know, everything's fine, and why are you trying to screw it up? We don't see race. We don't vote on race. We're happy with this situation. And what's the problem, or something like that. So, you know, there's still, I think, a lot of grounds to criticize the racial democracy notion and everything, but it is a really interesting finding in light of the fact that there are people who say, you know, it's real enough, and it's a good thing, not a bad thing. I have a kind of a more specific question about, you start saying, well, this is city council, and maybe the stakes aren't that high, and it just made me think, like, well, what if you did manipulations like this on a whole bunch of different things, and you didn't get effects on anything? Maybe people just don't care that much about these elections, and when they go to the polls, they're pretty marginally indifferent between a lot of the candidates, and maybe they're just voting on party lines, with, you know, if it's a part of another, if it's coinciding with the, you know, other elections of other offices, and that just made me think. Again, I'm way out of my field here, but there's these, you know, they do these surveys in the States, and they found that like 5% of Americans will say literally anything, you know, like, you know, Obama's a cactus or whatever like that. And those kind of results are good as a baseline because you realize that, like, you know, I got 5% of Americans to say something, it doesn't mean anything, right? And it'd be interesting to have that kind of a baseline here. I mean, what would candidates have to say in their videotaped message to drive a significant result? And I feel like in a way like we don't really know. I mean, you've got these very subtle racial and class manipulations. So what would a really crazy manipulation, how big of a result would it get? Maybe it wouldn't be that big either.
I mean, we did find candidate fixed effects. There were some people voters liked, and some people voters didn't like as much.
Are those large compared to?
I have to go back and look, to be honest, at the size, but I remember they were significant in a regression. You know, the thing about voting for candidates is that people do care about candidate attributes in these systems. We know that. So like the person who's received the most votes, or the second most votes in the history of Sao Paulo's elections for federal deputy, is a clown called Tiririca. And you know, people know Tiririca and they like Tiririca and they voted for Tiririca, and Tiririca is now doing good work in the federal Chamber of Deputies. So people vote for candidates in that sense, and they're just not voting on the candidate's race, at least not in this experiment, but they might be voting on other attributes of candidates.
You code the clown suit as a suit or dungaree?
Exactly. That is the key question. Dungarees, I think. But it's a suit.
Sean was obviously joking when he said, you know, maybe the real dimension is cats versus dogs. But if you think of some dimensions other than race and class, which are at least partially orthogonal to those, and may distract from race or class, isn't that something that in the bad old days we used to call false consciousness or Gramscian hegemony? I mean, are people overlooking something here? What's the stake?
Well, that was certainly part of my interest in the question and the prior I bring to the question. I mean, you know, here's Salvador, which is a city that is steeped in African tradition, where African descent is celebrated, and the city council is completely white, in a democracy, I mean, completely white, but, you know, 45% of over 40% of the councilors were coded as white, where they occupy less than 20% of the population according to the census. Yeah, it seemed like something's going on. So maybe elite manipulation is part of the story, you know, but maybe it's party effects, parties picking, you know, parties are picking candidates, and they're using the myth of racial democracy to mitigate racial outrage, and that's consistent with the findings. Race doesn't really matter, but it really should, or something. So I don't know, but.
And a question: were all of your actors handsome?
No, they varied in their handsomeness and in their age. I mean, who am I to judge? But they tended to vary, and
some are women, I assume, right?
No, they're all men, and you know that can be seen as a limitation of the study. But we want to, you know, in some sense, we want it for statistical reasons. We want to limit the variation, the race-independent variation across the candidates. So, we wanted to try to get a homogeneous set of candidates, but. This is a very imperfect aspect of designing this kind of study, I would say, from an inferential point of view, because you hope you get, you know, these 12 candidates in each city, and you hope that you're randomizing across, or you've got independence across race-independent features of the candidates. But so we sort of tried to pick, you know, some educated, apparently educated blacks and poorly educated blacks, and educated whites and poorly educated whites, and hope that kind of stuff washed out with enough actors. But it's not something that's easy to do.
Laura, let's take one more question.
Okay. So in the U.S., there's a lot of evidence that suggests that it's perceived race of the other that drives one's behavior, and you have 25% of your cases where their perceived race of the person they're evaluating is not what you assigned. And I assume you're presenting sort of intent to treat effects here. You're just presenting the race that you thought they were.
Mm-hmm.
But what about the perceived race? And do your results change? Oh, obviously, there are many ways to deal with this problem, you know, of compliance, it might be say. But a simple question is, if you just substitute for your tables perceived race rather than actual race, do your results show no finding? Because I think if you find no findings there, then that's really pretty stunning.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
25% of the people are seeing something other than what you saw.
Yeah, no, I mean I think that's an important point. So first on the non-compliance thing, we didn't do IV regressions because here it's a funny non-compliance problem because you don't have white candidates crossing over into black and black candidates crossing over into white. You have people crossing over into some other category of brown, and so we can't do the usual walled estimator approach. But so we didn't do that. I was reluctant to look at to analyze the effect of perceived race because that's because it's tied up. I agree with you, it'd be stunning, but it's tied up with tied up with how happy-go-lucky people are and how much they like other folks and all kinds of who knows, but all kinds of things could affect evaluations of candidates in general in the racial classification of candidates, and so I'd hesitate to draw as close an inference from that.
That's a huge percent, though, 25 compared to your.
No, it's a big percent.
Right?
You can still use the instrument. There's multi-way non-compliance, so you could now, there's non-parametric ways of doing it. Now, unlike the usual wall thing with one-way non-compliance, these are now involving real behavioral assumptions. So I wouldn't believe them, but they might be useful to run to figure out what the next experiment.
Yeah, so I'd like to talk to you both about that more. I mean, in the settings that I've looked at, you have crossover from one treatment condition to another. So you have treatment, you have 10 treatment conditions, and you have, assigned to A but took B, where B is a treatment condition. Here we have
essentially what you have. If you think about your treatment, what you're trying to do is create a perception, right? And so you could say that you can still treat it as equivalent to that.
Yeah, but we have assignment to treatment category A and assignment to treatment category C. Those are our two conditions, and these are people who are crossed over into condition B, which is not one of our assigned conditions. So
theory for that's worked out.
Okay, well, I want to know about that.
Now you have to make behavioral assumptions, right? So it's not as good as the wall thing. So I wouldn't believe it, but you might learn something about how to do the next experiment.
Okay, sounds good.
That was great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.